Talking about the weather, I thought we'd start with something slightly different. This is a cave bed, and that's a fleecy blanket, and that's a whippet saying, I'm staying out the drafts. And the follow-up to this is light the wood burner, and lo and behold, as if by magic, you get two whippets in front of the fire toasting their tummies. Very heat-sensitive doggies. Right, today we are going to talk about disease, and it's my least favourite part of the course, but it's something that everybody has to know about. Bear with me, I'm just checking we've got nobody else waiting to come in. So we have two notifiable diseases in the UK, and by notifiable this means if you suspect that you have either of these, you have to get in touch with the beekeeping authorities. You are effectively in the same position as a farmer who suspects he's got foot and mouth. So these two are the ones that you really, really need to know about. Now, I'm going to be absolutely honest with you here. The next wee while, everything I'm talking about from my perspective is theoretical, because I have never set eyes on American foul brood or European foul brood in real life, and I don't want to. I was saying to Morag while we were having a chat earlier that it's interesting to go onto B-Base and guddle around on that site. You don't have to register to have a look round. You know, it's all information that's freely available. And bring up your own area and have a look at what the incidence of disease actually is. Personally, my area, off the top of my head, there hasn't been a notifiable incident in the last 50 odd years. The records go back a fair distance. Because prior to the current setup, disease was managed by the three regional bee advisors who were based in the Scottish Colleges of Agriculture before they became the Scottish College of Agriculture. There used to be...
Εδώ Κωνσταντίνο δεν έχει...
Excuse me a minute.
Δεν το έχουμε το βίντεο, λοιπόν. Το κανάλι δεν είναι.
Πώς το κάνω το βίντεο?
Right, sorry about that. I forgot to mute everybody. Yeah, but back in the day, it was the colleges that had responsibility for looking after the disease situation, and after they basically paid their advisors off as a cost-saving exercise, there was a period of, I suppose, about 15 years or so where there was nobody actually responsible in Scotland for looking after the situation. However, that has now changed, and we have this situation. The Scottish Government is responsible for bee health policy in Scotland and the legislative control for the health of managed honeybees. There are currently around 1,400 hobby beekeepers who are members of the SBA, with an estimated further 1,000 who are not. I think that further 1,000 is possibly shooting a bit low, but there we are. There are also around 25 commercial bee farmers who are members of the Bee Farmers Association, whose businesses depend on the management of healthy honeybees. One of those members is a gentleman by the name of Murray McGregor, and you might find Murray's Twitter feed of some interest because he tells it as it is, and believe you me, he's no idiot, because he started out as a deck officer with Shell, and Shell does not employ people who are lacking a wit or three, and he now runs something in the region of 4,000 plus colonies of bees, and he keeps incredibly detailed records. If Murray says it is so, then trust me, it is so. No ifs, buts or maybes. The guy knows what he's talking about. So, as you can tell, I've got a great deal of respect for him, and he's probably one of the best beekeeping information sources around. Let's throw that out. Okay, so all beekeepers have a significant role to play in ensuring disease management and control measures within their own apiaries are in order, and have a legal obligation to report any suspicion of a notifiable disease or pest by using the following email. And then they mention BeeBase, which I've discussed a moment or two ago, and you are encouraged to register on BeeBase, which gives information to help those with an interest in honeybee health to keep their bees healthy. As I say, there is a lot of good information on BeeBase, and if you've got a few spare minutes and you want to do something in topping up your bee information, it'll do you no harm whatsoever to read some of the advisory leaflets on there. They're all downloadable as well, so you don't have to stream them. You can pick them up. Right, first one is European foul brood, and it's called that for the simple reason it was first found in Europe. You can get European foul brood in the States, you can get American foul brood in the UK. It's a bacterial disease that affects honeybee larvae before the capped stage. European foul brood disease is characterised by dead and dying larvae which can appear curled upwards, brown or yellow, melted and or dried out and rubbery. The causative bacteria, Melissococcus plutoneus, is ingested, and I spent a long time practicing that, is ingested by honeybee larvae, after which the bacterium competes for food inside the larvae. If the bacteria outcompetes the larva will die before the cell is capped. Alternatively, the bee may survive until adulthood if the larvae has sufficient food resources. European foul brood should not be confused with American foul brood, which is caused by a different bacteria that produces different symptoms and control requirements. European foul brood is considered to be more problematic in situations where forage nectar is sporadic or other situations that result in fewer nurse bees in colonies to feed larvae. At the onset of nectar flow in early spring, forage recruitment of house bees may increase rapidly, resulting in few bees in colonies to feed the honeybee larvae. Often when the nurse bee to larvae ratio stabilises later in the season or remains stable throughout a season, symptoms disappear. However, this disease can occur throughout a season and will sometimes not clear up on its own. In severe cases, colony death can occur. Also, yearly reoccurrence of EFB from contaminated combs and equipment can occur. The bacteria that causes EFB does not produce spores, but combs contaminated with the bacteria can still reinfect honeybees in subsequent years. Now, I mentioned Murray McGregor. He was unfortunate enough a few years ago to have an outbreak of European foul brood. And he did the right thing, contacted the authorities, and nothing seemed to kick off. So he took matters into his own hands, went abroad, bought the appropriate drug to treat the condition, and started treating. Then the authorities arrived in force And someone, ironically, because they I think they took a hissy fit, to be honest, and they took him to court. And they took him to court for using an unlicensed drug to treat the condition. And then turned round and used the same drug acquired in the UK to treat the condition, which I thought was really adding insult to injury. I mean, bearing in mind that Murray was in a position of thousands of colonies of bees needing treatment, and he's always got his eye fixed on the heather harvest, because that's really his main income for the year. It's not quite a one-trick pony, but it's pretty close to it. And he could see his heather harvest disappearing down the tube of government inactivity. But anyway, you may remember seeing the headlines of the royal beekeeper being taken to court. And that's because he had a few hives on Balmoral Estate. Nothing to do with actually producing honey for the royals, just happened to have a few bees there. But the press, of course, will twist things any way they can. So, what does it look like? That one there is a relatively normal looking larvae, curled up, sitting comfortable in its cell. That's not, and that's definitely not. Can everybody see the difference? Pearly white, sitting comfortably, pearly white, sitting comfortably. That one is probably infected, it's got a yellowy tinge to it. That definitely has. That has for sure, and so is that. So, when you're doing your comb inspections, this is the sort of thing that you're looking for. Apart from, is the queen expanding, is she laying eggs, you need to look at the larvae themselves and just double check they're all nice, white and curled up, sitting comfortably. This is what you are keeping an eye out for. So that is European foul brood. Treatment wise is in the hands of the authorities. If they deem it reasonable, they will chemically treat. If they deem it beyond hope, then they will destroy. So, the next one is the real baddie, and it's American foul brood. And I'm going to go back to front here. Classic hotspots, Aberdeenshire and Perthshire. The spores can last and infect for at least 70 years. Now, I can remember Bernard Mobus telling me that he had dealt with an outbreak in Aberdeenshire personally, and that Bob Couston, who was his equivalent down on the East College, had been dealing with AFB in Perthshire, and there was a history that went back to at least the 1900s of Aberdeenshire and Perthshire being hotspots. So, how do you avoid it? It's kind of in the laps of the gods to a point, because you can buy all new equipment, and as beginners you most likely will buy all new equipment. Buying second-hand equipment always carries the risk of some sort of contact with a infectious disease. So, American foul brood is a bacterial brood disease that results from the infection of honeybee larvae with Pedibacillus larvae. It used to be called bacillus larvae. While it only attacks larvae, American foul brood weakens the colony and quickly lead to its death in only 3 weeks. So it's devastating. It's highly infectious, and one of the main means of transmission is rubbing. Another means of transmission is drifting. Remember I said if you get a long line of colonies and the prevailing wind is west to east, which it normally is in the UK, the hives at the far end of that line, the easterly end, are most at risk, because bees will drift down the line and sort of, especially in a wind, and dive into the last hive. Robbing bees are terrible robbers. Some strains are worse than others, some hives are far worse than others. And if they sense that a colony can no longer defend itself, well, why go out and collect nectar and go to all the bother of drying it and turning it into bonny honey when you can nip next door and rob out the neighbours? So, American foul brood is most commonly transmitted through spores of the bacteria which can be dormant in the colonies or used equipment for 70 or more years. When nurse bees feed larvae with food contaminated with spores, the spores turn into a vegetative stage that replicates in the larval tissue, leading to its death. Larvae killed by these bacteria have a unique foul odour that gives this brood disease its name. And again, the hotspots, Aberdeenshire and Perthshire. Classic American foul brood, due to being found, refers to the American part of the name. That's where it was found. You get this, what they call a pepper pot appearance of sealed brood. And I mean, I'm not being funny, but anybody taking a look at that would immediately say there's something not right. I mean, it's pretty obvious that that is just wrong compared to these healthy cap cells here. I mean, that just yells, I'm sick. The classic, hang on a minute, I lost a slide, bear with me. The classic test, I mean, the royal one shouldn't be there. Right. The classic test for American foul brood is the matchstick test. When you see these coffee coloured larvae, you take a matchstick and you kind of stir it round and then gently ease it back, and if you get this ropiness from the larvae, and that will pull back to about an inch, 25 mil, before it will separate off the matchstick, that is the classic American foul brood ropiness test. And the reason it's slightly historical now, I suppose. The reason that they call it a matchstick test is that a matchstick was something that beekeepers normally always had on them, because they used matches, or used to use matches, to light their smokers. Whereas nowadays, I think most people either use a little propane torch or a lighter. As an aside, there was actually a way of introducing queens using a matchbox, and again that was devised because beekeepers had empty matchboxes because they were using umpteen matches lighting smokers, and so on and so on and so on. Anyway, treatment for American foul brood? None. The colony is killed with petrol. It is wrapped up in cling film, taken to a burn site, which is a pit dug in the ground, plonked in, covered in petrol, and well and truly incinerated. It's that dangerous. When I compared it to foot and mouth disease, I meant it. Having said all of this, bear in mind, I personally, in 33 years, have never seen an outbreak of disease. Have I been lucky? Or am I normal? I don't know. I'm not asking you to think I'm normal. That's not up for debate. Other problems. There's a thing called nosema. There's also acarine. There's chalk brood, and there's sac brood. Nosema is a little beastie that lives inside the bees. It's not really now considered to be terribly serious. Acarine seems to have virtually vanished due to oxalic acid. Chalk brood is a problem where you get mummies, and if you pick up bees to move them, you'll sometimes hear these mummies rattling on the screened floors. Again, mainly it's a genetic problem. Requeen. Sac brood is another minor issue, and again people would say requeen. I haven't honestly seen Nosema or Acarine for long enough. Chalk brood, I have seen the last couple of years. It seems to crop up a bit like European foul brood when the weather's a bit rubbish. It comes and it goes, but it's not serious. So Nosema apis is a microsporidian. It's a small single-cell parasite affecting honeybees. It causes nosemosis, mainly known by the term nosema. Although parasitic, it is often thought of and talked about as a disease. A single spore can cause infection, but the mean infective dose is generally reported to be 20 to 90 spores per bee. The dormant spore is resistant to extremes of temperature and dehydration, and the spores are long-lived. There isn't currently a treatment for it that I'm aware of. Acarine is technically called Acarapis woodi. Now, a little story here for you. In fact, two stories. Woodi refers to Mr. Wood of Bankery, who back in, I think off the top of my head, it was either 1922 or 1928, possibly 28, was so worried about Acarine, because it was a huge discussion at the time that Acarine was the causative agent of the famous or infamous Isle of Wight disease, and the colonies were getting devastated. Mr. Wood approached the North of Scotland College of Agriculture's beekeeping unit at Crebston, and he gave them £6,000 Karching to do some research. They did the research. They discovered Acarine, which is actually a beastie living in the spiracles of the bees. And just to put this into perspective, the £6,000 then is probably circa £145,000 today. Now, you might think that 1928 was a very long time ago, but I actually knew a gentleman from Aboyne, Alistair Liddell, who as a teenager knew personally Mr. Wood. So it's only 2 generations back that all this happened. And Brother Adam, who you've probably heard of, the famous monk, he declared that the Isle of Wight disease had completely killed off all the native bees in the UK. Now, I find that an absolutely ridiculous statement, because the guy at the time was cooped up in a monastery in deepest, darkest Devon. How he could pontificate on the state of Scottish colonies in Aberdeenshire and Caithness just beggars belief. And I don't believe it for a minute. I just don't. And if you do some research on Google into the Isle of Wight disease, there is a very interesting paper by a gentleman whose name currently escapes me. And he put the so-called Isle of Wight disease, because it was first discovered there, down to 2 or 3 very, very bad seasons. And it was actually more or less starvation rather than an infective cause. So anyway, that is Acarine. Diagnosing Nosema and Acarine, if you are so inclined, is pretty straightforward. You need a microscope with a 400 and a 40 lens. Acarine needs the 40. You whip off the head using a pin, turn the body so the insides can be seen, and the Acarine will be visible as little black dots. Grind the bodies up after you've done your Acarine, and put a sample of water on a slide, and the spores will look like little rice grains. They're very conspicuous. Nosema may well flare up in weak winter clusters, leading to diarrhea in the hive, classic feces strings inside the brood chamber and on the top bars. The best for protection for a wintering hive up to a certain point, because you can't have too many bees, is more bees. In other words, the best colonies going into the winter are strong colonies. The sac brood is an infection of brood caused by a Flarius genus and occurs when a diseased larvae fails to pupate after they've been sealed in its cell. Fluid then accumulates between the body of the larvae and the unshed skin, forming a sac. It's a relatively common disease during the first half of the brood rearing season, in other words, when things are a bit on the cool side, and can often exist unnoticed, affecting only a small percentage of the brood, does not usually cause severe colony loss. Answer to it, re-queen. Now, this is the start of the one that virtually everybody in the country, apart from the far northwest, Colonsay and Orkney, I'm not sure about Shetland's current condition, although I believe they are Varroa free, it is Varroa destructor. Now, this arrived in the UK in 1992. Varroa destructor, the Varroa mite, is an external parasitic mite that attacks and feeds on honeybees Apis cerana and Apis mellifera. Apis cerana is the Indian subcontinent and those parts of the world, is the native bee there, and it apparently has a grooming behaviour that enables it to keep Varroa under control. There's a balance has been struck, and when the Raj tried to import European honeybees into India because the Apis cerana has relatively small colonies and they wanted to increase honey production, the colonies lasted 2-3 years and died. Nobody knew why, but we now know that Apis mellifera has no defence mechanism against Varroa, and it was more than likely varroaceus that wiped out the European honeybees when we tried to introduce them into India. The Varroa mite can reproduce only in a honeybee colony. It attaches to the body of the bee and weakens the bee by sucking fat bodies and hemolymph. A mother mite may lay an egg every 36 hours on the side of a cell. And this is a cell which is just been sealed. They wait until they see the bees just about to seal brood cells and they slide in. I've actually seen live Varroa in a lab setting, and they are bloody fast on their tootsies. They can jump several inches in one hop, and for the size of them, I mean, it must be like a long jumper doing a 50-meter jump. Anyway, so they slide into these cells just as they're being hatched, and the first egg usually hatches into a male, and that stays inside the cell. The other eggs hatch into females and feed and grow within the cell. Next, they mate with the male, so it's an incestuous relationship, and emerge from the cell when the bee emerges. The mother mite will seek out another cell, while her daughter mites may hitch a ride on an adult bee and feed for a while before finding a new larval host. Mite populations increase slowly when starting from just a few mites, but the hitchhiking behaviour of the mite can spread large numbers with drifting or robbing, causing a hive to quickly become heavily infested. When a larvae is infested by 2 or 3 mites, it will usually die. As a colony reaches a point of collapse, bees sometimes abandon the hive and carry mites to neighbouring hives. What's called collapse swarming. So, a couple of pretty pictures for you. Female mite looks like a red crab, and that blob there, I know it's not very clear, but there is a blob there, is a baby female, And that blob there, if you can make it out, there's the 4 antennae legs at the front, and that white there is the body. And that's a heavily infested larvae. That's doomed. That's going to get bled to death. So it's interesting how Varroa gets spread. I mean, once it came into Europe, it came through Europe like a dose of salts. Now, the thing that's odd to my mind is Varroa spread through the UK well under 10 years, and yet Collins is free, Orkney is free. So the vector, to my mind, for how it spread through Europe and through Britain so fast is man. Because if it was spreading naturally, then sooner or later a swarm of bees would have been in a lorry or something across the water to Orkney and infect Orkney, but it hasn't happened, or not that we know of anyway. So the main vectors: drifting, colony collapse, man, and of course robbing, which I should have put next to drifting. Now this is where it gets a little bit murky, shall we say. The legal treatments, and I looked this up this morning just to double check, there's 3 of them. There's AP VAR, there's AP Life VAR, and there's AP Boxeal. AP VAR's 10 strips for £31. AP Life VAR is £2.49 for 2 strips, but you need 4 per colony, so it's £4.98 a colony. Excuse me just a minute. Alright. Georgia, excuse me everybody, just send me an email and I'll organise a link for you. Right, so you're looking at, let's call it for round figures, £5 to treat a colony. If you've got 2 colonies, that's a tenner. I suppose that's quite reasonable. But once you've got 20 colonies or 100 colonies, it starts to get a little bit more expensive. And this is the problem. The reason these treatments are expensive is not the companies are making a rip-off, it's the fact that they've had to jump through the legal hurdles and testing to have an approved treatment, Veterinary Medicines Act. But many beekeepers, because beekeepers are fairly famous for wanting to shave a couple of pennies here or there. I mean, I think the average beekeeper is the product of a very tight Aberdeenshire farmer crossed with a very tight Yorkshire farmer. And then they decided to get really tight. Wallets, moths, you know, you've heard it all. Anyway, so many ignore the legal treatments and make up their own. Far cheaper, just as effective. Oxalic acid is the chemical, and some trickle it in a syrup and some use vaporizers. It's entirely up to you which system you decide to use. But bear in mind you have a legal responsibility to keep records of the medicines that you administer to your bees. And I'd imagine people look at something like AP Life VAR, they buy a packet, and if they're asked to prove that this is what they use, they blow the dust off it from some dark corner in the garage and say to the person that's asking the questions, this is what I use, look, I've got some right here. Whether morally it's right or wrong, I don't know. I'll leave it up to you to make your own decisions. Other pests. You've possibly seen in the press there's been quite a lot about Asian hornet. That's the one that climate warming is possibly going to bring into certainly the south of Britain. They can actually kill an entire colony by feeding off the foragers. Woodpeckers. Woodpeckers can be a serious nuisance. They can drill holes in the side of hives. They can annoy the bees. They can disturb the winter clusters. Mice can kill winter colonies. This is why you have mice excluders. And I will just mention that, can you see the pencil? And you can see the end of the pencil, the red dot. That red dot's approximately 8 millimeters. What's important about 8 millimeters? Well, if you have an entrance that is 8 millimeters deep, in other words, my pencil will just neatly fit in and out, mice can't get in. Make it 9 millimeters and you could be in trouble. Because the little so-and-sos, if they can get their head through a gap, they can flatten out, their ribs are so flexible, they can flatten out their bodies and tiger crawl in with their little tootsies. And then you've got Mrs. Mouse in your house. They're horrible little things. When I was at agricultural college, many years ago, they had a very impressive film. And what they did was they took a house that was due to be demolished anyway, they sealed it absolutely mouse tight, and they let loose a pair of mice. And the house was furnished as if the occupants had gone away for the weekend. So there was, there was breakfast cereals and all the usual bits and bobs. 6 months later, some brave soul opened it up. Although I think they probably gassed it first. And literally that house was going to take one good poke with a finger and it was going to collapse. They'd stripped all the insulation off the electrics, they'd eaten through all the floorboards, they'd eaten through the joists. It was a disaster. Don't underestimate the damage that Mrs. Mouse and progeny can do. It is absolutely terrifying. I'm currently busy trapping them in my garage at the moment, and some mornings I'm waking up to find two or three as I go. Right, mice. Asian hornet we've covered, and that leaves the last one, folks. Humans. And they can arguably be the worst of the lot. Varroa vector, humans. Vandalism, humans. They can be absolutely horrible, and also they're sticky fingered, some of them. They're not above nicking your bees. I've actually lost a nucleus. I've only ever lost the one, but I have suffered personally from theft. So when I see people saying, "Oh, I strapped down my hives for the winter," I think you're an idiot. You're inviting somebody to come along and pick it up because you've done half the hive shut in for them. All they've got to do is close the entrance and pick it up and walk. You know. So, just be aware. Keep your bees out of sight. Google Earth, when it comes to apiaries, is not your friend. In fact, some people take quite a lot of amusement out of seeing that Google Earth is still showing their bees where they were 5 years ago. So, there ends the first section today. I'm going to take a short break here because we're going to go through the common honey plants in the UK next, and that'll take me about 40-45 minutes. It'll be a fairly short session today. I don't apologise for it, but there we are. So, 5-minute break, folks.
just on that previous subject of weather, Pete, Tinto has now completely disappeared, so it looks like I'm getting what you've got. Thank you.
While I was making coffee, I was just pondering on the humans, and I'd temporarily forgotten that when I took over Crepston, I also was given the heather sites that the college had been using for many years. For those of you, or if any of you are in Aberdeenshire, then it was Glendy, which is off the Cairnamount Road. You come up over the first section, you come down a long slope, there's a very tight little bridge that got damaged a few years ago and the road got shut for long enough. And there's a gate just a few yards beyond that bridge, and I had a key to that gate. And that was fine. Had some lovely takes of heather from there, until a person decided that they would write a book about walks, and one of the walks was up Glendy, and so many people started going up and down there. In fact, I turned up to look at the bees one day, and there was 6 coaches parked up, and the people pressure ended up with basically I had lost the site, simple as that, which was rather depressing. Where are we? Now, I must give credit to Mr. Jerry Collins, NDB, National Diploma of Beekeeping. If you want to exercise your intellect and have a real seriously in-depth beekeeping knowledge, then you can do the NDB course. Some of them are pretty good beekeepers, and some of them know an awful lot about bees, but I wouldn't actually call them competent beekeepers. But anyway, that's another issue altogether. So, this is, in no particular order, the more important honeybee species of plant in the UK, or plants that are of importance to honeybees. Down in especially Kent and the Vale of Evesham, although the Vale of Evesham, so what's going on down there is an absolute disgrace. Julie, my wife, had an uncle who was a horticulturist in the Vale of Evesham, and it's some of the best farming land in the UK. I mean, absolutely amazing ground, amazing climate, and they're building houses like they're going out of fashion, and you think, why on earth are you building in the best farming land in the country? How are we going to feed ourselves? Absolute insanity. Okay, so many bee farmers make a major part of their income from pollination fees, and they take their highest to the orchards. 2014 they were getting paid £60 a hive and £50 for seed crops, £105 for restricted flight crops under netting and in greenhouses, and normally the colonies are rented for 4 weeks or so. If longer, get a wee bit extra, and also agreements about spraying. Yeah. Hive of bees pollinating apples by the looks of things. This is quite interesting actually. 5 to 10% of the apple flowers need to be pollinated to get a full economic crop of the top class grade apples. Less than that, you get misshapen fruit or small apples, and the bees can be asked to be moved out ASAP because the farmers have a way of telling what the level of pollination is, and once it's been achieved, basically the bees then become a liability and they want them away. Pears, proof of the pudding. Cherries, flowers, and also these extra floral nectaries at the base of the leaves. Oilseed rape. This is an interesting one. Initially, there was a lot of resentment amongst the beekeeping community at oilseed rape because it granulates very fast, and it granulates quite often without the bees capping it over. So you pull out a frame, you look at it, you think, oh, that's not finished, and you stick it back in, but in actual fact it is finished. And back in the day, the system really was you had your bees, you added your first super, you added your second super, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, whatever. And then as the summer flowers diminished and the bell heather came on, or the ling started to show a bit of activity, you cleared off your bees, you moved them to the heather, you stuck a couple of supers on, crossed your fingers for the weather, and you got your heather crop. While your bees were at the heather, you were extracting your supers of lovely summer honey, and everything was joyous and happy until along came OSR, because it sets like concrete. And what's worse is it contaminates the other honey that's on the colony, and the whole lot sets like concrete. And when I say it sets like concrete, I have literally bent a spoon, and not a teaspoon, a good solid dessert spoon, trying to get oilseed rape out of a jar. So when I say solid, I mean solid. So the first few years after the oilseed rape appeared in the countryside, there was a lot of panic and consternation amongst the beekeepers until they worked out how to handle it. How do you handle it? Well, I'm sort of verging on what I'm going to talk about next week, but you get it off fast, off the hives, and then you get it spun out and you run it off into buckets, you let it set, and then once it's set, you can deal with it. Having said all of this, back in my day, when I was semi-commercial, I was taking a good ton off the oilseed rape with 40 to 50 colonies. And when I got up to a couple of years, I was up around about the 70-80 mark, I was taking off 1 3/4 tons. And that was absolutely lovely, obviously, and it was worth a considerable amount of money. Now, sorry, I should say, back in the day it was productive, it flowered, as some of you will remember, for the best part of 8 weeks, sometimes even longer. Now it pops up, it turns yellow, it hangs around for about 10 days, the first really good shower of rain, and the fields start turning green. It's done and dusted inside, usually now 21 days. And this is happening. I always used to have the bees on my rape fields by the 3rd week in April, and the bees built up on the rape, supered on the 8 frames, etc. On we went, all nice and straightforward. And when the bees got up to power, they started storming the nectar in, and I got my big return. Now, it's still flowering in the third week in April, but it's finished the second or third week in May. Whereas I was getting my big crops end of May, start of June, by which time it's history. So it's not the crop it used to be. That'd make me feel really old, seeing an entire crop sort of come and go in my lifetime. Cue violins. Commercial bees, working the house's rape, and no, I wouldn't have them as close as that. I think has been a bit silly. Although in saying that, I think he's got them on pallets, so he's just skewed them a wee bit. But do you notice how similar the paint job is? There's your drifting issue right there. Then borage. I've had borage on a farm I was on, but never really did anything great. That's not to say that you might not get a crop off it. And then moving the bees, it's well worth it if you've got a crop that is going to be really productive. The commercial boys, they move bees when they haven't got any income coming in to somewhere where there is income to be had. And monofloral honeys like borage and heather command a price premium, which increases the range of honeys that the bee farmers have to sell, which makes sense. Phacelia, grown to be ploughed evergreen manure, and a lovely light honey. That's it. Performing. I've had that as well. Can't say I got a huge return off it, but you know, it was there. Field beans. Honey bees may use the back door, collecting nectar from holes bitten into the base by bumblebees. Now, the farm I used to be on at Castle Donington was right next to East Midlands Airport, and he grew wheat, barley, oilseed rape and the field beans. I've got to be honest, I never really saw much of a return off the field beans. I'm telling you about an awful lot of failures. I must have a couple of successes to talk about. Ling heather, not to be confused with bell heather. And again, I'm kind of touching on next week, but ling has a very peculiar quality to it, which is called, and this is a lovely word, can't even say it now. The honey is a jelly, and the jelly can be turned to liquid by agitation. I just sold my Sajali's agitator last year for £1,000, so you can imagine what it cost me when I bought it. And heather has a very unique smell, and it is the premium honey crop of the UK. That's the reason that Mr. McGregor concentrates all his efforts on getting his bees up to the heather, and actually by my calculations I think he had a turnover of over £1 million on his heather last year. That's how important it is. Bees sitting in the lee of a wall with the heather moors behind them. That is a classic setup. Absolutely ideal. Out of the prevailing wind, and the moors just about to come into flower. Don't believe it when somebody says to you, the 12th, the glorious 12th, have your bees up. Rubbish. You need to be up at least 2 to 3 weeks before that. I've seen the entire heather come and go before some guys even had their bees up to the heather. I was at a honey show, and I overheard a couple of the worthies saying, "Ah, half a poor heather is here, half a poor, aye, I'm in, nothing at all, me. Aye, and I had a ton sitting in the honey house. I rest my case. Bell heather. Bell is a liquid honey, unlike heather, unlike the ling. Very dark honey, described as a port wine colour. Some people argue it's not really heather honey. It should be sold as honey from the heather moors. Others disagree. Parsnip. Bees can get at least pollen from that, if not a bit of nectar. Gooseberries. My bees love our gooseberries. Although in saying that, I think the majority of our gooseberry pollination is actually done by small bumbles. Onions or leeks, if they go to seed, can be beneficial. Marrow, pollen off that. Runner beans. Again, the bees at the very least can get pollen off that, if not nectar. Hang on a minute. Rosemary, the herb. Bees get very active on the rosemary. Brambles, nice light honey. Bramble fruits. Raspberry. Raspberry can be quite important in Scotland because maybe not as commercially grown as it was, because Hartleys don't have their plant in Dundee now, but my first wife's grandmother used to take bees to the rasps, and if you remember the story I told you about the kerfuffle with the honey running out of the tank, it was raspberry honey. And raspberries have a tendency to granulate early, the same as oilseed rape, and also the same tendency to contaminate other honeys. So raspberry, if you've got a lot in your area, that's something to keep an eye on. Sunflowers, not particularly important in Scotland, I wouldn't have said, but obviously they do get worked. Evening primrose, grown for the oil. Lavender, obviously grown for scent. There used to be a commercial operation for lavender at Bankery on Royal Deeside. Long gone now, but it was a commercial proposition for a while. Sweet chestnut, cow parsley, privet, which is not a very nice honey. I went through these last night and I thought to myself, there's something missing. And it's still missing, I think, but we'll find out when we get to the end. Mallow, I honestly don't know. I've never even heard of the plant. So whether this is more of a south of England thing, I don't know. Because the gentleman who lent me these presentation is based down south. Hawthorn, important in May. It's a good pollen source, and now and again it produces honey. In fact, I was on an oilseed rape site on a farm, and there was an old hedge that had gone, but there was just the odd hawthorn tree left. And when I was extracting the honey, in the comb there was an arch of really dark honey surrounded by the oilseed rape honey, and the dark honey was off the hawthorn. And I was furious because I couldn't get it out without extracting the oilseed rape at the same time. There you go, some you win, some you lose. Dog rose, obviously been worked for pollen, evidence is on the pollen baskets. Rosebay willow herb. It can be, in some parts of the world, a very important honey plant, this. The classic location is Vancouver Island. They practice clear felling there, and the year after they clear a section of the forest, the Rosebay willow herb comes up like it's going out of fashion, and they move thousands of colonies to work it. So it's very important in some places. Pussy willow. My site at East Midlands Airport had within 500 yards of the colonies about 3/4 of a mile of willow that came into pollen in the spring. Absolutely marvellous to walk along there and hear the willows humming with the bees. Ivy. Now you'll read a lot about people having big harvests of ivy. I have only ever once seen ivy in flower in Scotland, and I know other people tell me that they have it flowering quite regularly here, there and everywhere, but personally the only place I've ever seen it was on the banks of the Tweed at Kelso, and that was 2 years ago. And I've seen it, I should say that comment refers to Scotland. Down at Castle Donington in the East Mids, yes, it flowered and the bees worked it. Can't say it was particularly profuse, but some people say they get a couple of supers of it. So we're going to scroll up a bit. Holly, another one worked for, I believe, nectar and pollen. Lime. Now then. The story about lime is it needs wet feet. So if it's been a fairly dry winter, there's not much chance of a decent crop off the lime. The very first time I saw honey in the comb on hives was when I went to visit a bee farmer on the Black Isle. And he and his son were taking off a crop of lime from an apiary of 40 colonies, and each hive had between 2 and 3 supers which were rammed and crammed. Absolutely solid. Each colony had a good 100 to 120 pounds of honey on it. I got caught out at Castle Donington because I suddenly one year had a flow start early July, and I couldn't figure out where on earth this was coming from, so I went for a little walk, and to my astonishment I discovered within 500 metres of the bees there was 28 lime trees, and they were gushing. Long story short, I set a record that year that I don't think I will ever surpass. One colony produced 230 pounds of comb honey. Given that the 10-year average in the UK is 40 pounds a colony, that was pretty good. Laurel, flowers, and again the extra nectaries. Knapweed, pollen. Forget-me-nots. I don't know how important a honey plant that is. I guess it's just something that happens to be a bit useful. Clover. Now, you see fields of clover that have been sown by the farmers. They're really not a lot of use to the beekeeper because the florets are so far down inside these structures, the bees' tongues just aren't long enough to get the access. The clover that back in the day the people got the sections from, and big takes of clover, was from the wild white clover, and that's the clover. It's a little diddy one. It's only about so high, inch or so, and you get that kind of clover on what I've heard described as starve-acre ground. It's poor ground. There's no fertilizer being used on it. There's probably sheep on it, and it's very likely to be at a bit of an altitude. And believe it or not, the very best clover quite often is within 7 miles of the coast and has a touch of salt being added to it from the breezes of the sea. Himalayan balm, or balsam, depending on how you want to pronounce it. The purists hate it, as in the native species type purists. There's quite a lot of it around here, and very distinctively the bees come in with a sort of a light tan jacket on their backs, because as they go into the flower and they work on the stamens, there's a trigger and the stamen goes and whacks the back of the bee, making sure there's a good coating of pollen on it before it goes into the next flower. The same exercise actually happens with whins. The flowers on whins do exactly the same thing, and you'll see the bees coming in with bright yellow backs. You'll know where they've been. Ragwort, or stinking willies. When I was at college, actually, we went round the class names for ragwort, and we came up with, I think it was 27 different names for the stuff. Not a nice honey, actually, and in actual fact, that's a disgrace. Allowing that to grow to that extent is not neighbourly, to put it mildly. Giant hogweed. Now then. Many years ago, I was working on an estate, and the owner decided he wanted to clear out a bit of the old garden that had got really overgrown, and it had giant hogweed in amongst it. So they went in with a single chop forage harvester, which was basically just a flail with a chute that spat it out, a very early type of silage machine. Minced all this stuff up, and it was raked up, and the gardener and his son, who were both redheads, so fairly sensitive skin to start with, boiling hot day, they were raking this stuff up into bundles and carrying it against their chests with their shirts off. They both ended up in A&E with huge blisters on their skin. When it says resulting in blisters and severe skin inflammation, they are not joking. That has to be treated with the utmost respect. Very, very nasty stuff. Figwort, I must admit, I don't think I've ever seen it. Certainly not up here, so I suspect again it's another southerly plant. Horse chestnut, very distinctive pollen, brick red. You'll see it in the combs, and it's very obvious in the comb, and equally it's very obvious on the trees. Very conspicuous one. Blackthorn, or the sloe, probably at about the same level as brambles and hawthorn. Sycamore, one of the quiet ones. It's green, flowers quite high up. You tend not to notice it, but useful nonetheless. Hebe, hellebore, stinking hellebore, fuchsia. Now, a friend of mine has got bees on Shetland, and I know this, two reasons. One, he tells me about them, and secondly, I sent them to him in the first place. However, he decided he would chance his arm, I think it was about his 3rd or 4th year of beekeeping, and he would send some honey down to the National Honey Show. And he got a second. And the honey was from the fuchsia in Lerwick. It's also a very profuse and prolific plant in Southern Ireland. You drive down some of the lanes there and there's just hedges of fuchsia. In fact, Angus tells me that his bees fly down the back of the dikes in the Lee, then dart across a road and fly further down into Lerwick along the shelter, work the fuchsia, and then repeat the route back, keeping behind the dikes. They're not daft. I hope some of you know this, because I've never heard of it. Obviously from the pollen baskets, it's a pollen producer, and the photograph is showing it there. In fact, I actually think that's pollen that's fallen off from the leaves. Whether there's nectar or not, I just don't know. Goldenrod, pollen again. Great hyacinth, lovely smell of course. St. John's wort. Buddleia, nectar and pollen for definite, because I've seen the bees working it. Lupins, same again. Marsh marigold. Snowdrop, a very important spring pollen source for the bees. It certainly pays to plant snowdrops. It also pays to plant crocus. Snowdrop is extra useful because with the petals hanging down, the pollen is protected from the wet. Poppies, pollen, no nectar. Cranesbill, pollen I suspect. Berberis, bees love it. We've got berberis in the garden here. Crocus, look at that. I mean, that is having an orgy in the pollen. Oh, the one that's missing, or two that's missing actually, hazel, which can be a very early pollen source, and that's when I start sneezing in the springtime, and gorse. Gorse can be quite prolific. If you drive past a decent, what would you call it, plantation, collection, group of gorse plants, and the weather is warm and slightly humid, you can get a really powerful smell off the gorse. It can be quite prolific. And when all is said and done, bees fly a maximum really of 1.5 miles. 2 pi r, so 2.3.14 times 0.75, 0.75 being half 1.5 miles, and the radius gives you 1.767 square miles. That's the area they have under their wings. Take the family for a walk, have a look around. You may well be amazed, as I have been, thinking of my lime trees. So I'm going to call it a night at that. Have we got any questions? I'm just going to... Right.
Pete, you mentioned about treatment of varroa. You said that the treatments that you mentioned were legal treatments. Does that mean that oxalic acid on a vaporizer isn't a legal treatment?
One of those chemicals can be used in a vaporizer, which is legal. It's as I say, it's a grey area, and I'm not keen to be seen to be promoting one thing or the other. I'm just saying that these are the legal treatments, and that's what they cost, and some people use them and some people don't. Daffodils are no use to bees. Most of them are F1 hybrids, and so they're not very productive. Jan, what do you mean by when would you expect bees to normally emerge in lowland Scotland?
To come out of the hive and start looking for pollen and begin to feed again.
The first sunny day with low winds and the pollen sources available. So snowdrop, I mean, here I'm down beside Jedburgh, 10 miles from the border. So this spring we had snowdrops out by the end of January. As I say, if the snowdrops are out, the weather's warm enough for the bees to fly, they'll fly and start harvesting.
So temperatures of what, 8 degrees?
8 plus, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. But the critical bit really is the wind chill.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I have a weather station in the house, and today it was saying 5, but with the wind chill, it was actually 1.
Mm.
It makes a huge odds.
Mm.
If I was doing a bit of planting, I'd be planting crocus and snowdrop.
Crocus and
Snowdrop.
snowdrop.
Yeah. Snowdrop especially because, as I say, it's got its little rain jacket on, whereas crocus tends to get washed out. Snowdrop's a bit more reliable. If you've got the space, pussy willow.
Yeah.
Andrea's saying typical, we've just planted hundreds of daffodils. Well. Well, I put 1,000 crocus into my lawn. And it was the village have got a bulb planter. It's like a stainless steel cone, 3 inches across at the bottom, and it was amazing how fast we could plant those bulbs using that tool. Okay, honeysuckle, no. Moths and bumbles, yes. Right, folks, next week I'm going to be talking about honey extraction, some tips and tricks to help you make it a bit easier, and also some information about beeswax, which is a side product that is greatly undervalued and overlooked. I had a chap asking if I had some kilos of wax for sale just a couple of days ago. I said, yeah. And he said, how much do you want for it? I said, well, you're buying. He says, what are you offering? He said, can I PM you? I said, yeah, sure, you can PM me. And he wanted to offer me, I think it was something utterly ridiculous, like £2 a pound. And I said, you are having a giraffe. I said, I won't let candle quality wax go for less than £2 an ounce. And he said, why? I said, simple. A 1 ounce candle will retail at getting on for £5. Therefore, the wax has got to be worth £2. I think that's perfectly reasonable. So anyway, we declined each other's business. So I'll look forward to talking to you next week. Apologies for being a bit short this week, but it doesn't really take that long to go through the diseases and go through the plants. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you, Pete. That was really good. Thank you.
Μάλλον δεν ξέρω πώς θα το κλείσω. Δεν ξέρω πώς θα το κλείσω.